1, 2, test, test. Okay. Special edition. American Swahili News pamoja na Swahili Online TV tunafuatilia. Makamu wa Rais wa Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania Dr. Philip Isdori Mpango. Dr. Isdori Philip Mpango amehutubia Baraza Kuu la Umoja wa Mataifa au United Nations General Debate la 77 la section ya 77 hapo Washington, hapo New York, na tunawaleteni special edition hii ambao sasa inabidi msikilize hotuba yake ya makamu wa rais wa Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania aliyoitoa hapo New York, katika mkutano ambao unaendelea ambao utaisha hapo tarehe 26. Umeanza tarehe 20 mpaka tarehe 26. Kwa hiyo kwa hisani ya Umoja wa Mataifa, hii hapa ni hotuba ya makamu wa rais wa Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania Dr. Isdori Philip Mpango. Philip Isdori Mpango huyu hapa anaanza kuongea.
President of the United Nations General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished delegates. I wish to begin by conveying to this august body fraternal greetings from Her Excellency Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of the United Republic of Tanzania, who could not attend this year's session due to pressing national commitments. It is therefore my distinct honor and privilege to address the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the government and people of the United Republic of Tanzania. Let me join those who have spoken before me in congratulating you, Mr. President, on your election to preside over the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I assure you of Tanzania's support and cooperation as you discharge your responsibilities. Let me also extend our appreciation to the United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, and the entire UN Secretariat for their dedicated service as guardians of the common interest of all peoples and all states, particularly during this time of unprecedented global challenges. Mr. President, this assembly is convening at a critical point when the world is engulfed in dangerous flames ranging from conflicts and mounting geopolitical tensions, devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, food and energy insecurity, environmental carnage, and extreme climate change-related events, to barriers to education, technology, and opportunity for shared prosperity. These challenges are in turn inextricably linked with and propelling stubborn global poverty. Furthermore, with only 8 years remaining before 2030, the world is still way off the mark in meeting many of the targets that we set in 2015. The root cause of all these challenges is human greed, selfish desire, and unilateralism. Yet we know for sure that unilateralism, driven by greed, is leading us, rich and poor, strong and weak, to a catastrophe. For it is now evident that these challenges have and continue to inflict enormous disruptive impacts on economies, ecosystems, and social lives worldwide, with sub-Saharan African countries and other developing countries being hit disproportionately. We have a famous proverb in Kiswahili which says, Where there are problems, ingenuity increases. In this spirit, we in Tanzania are convinced that transformative solutions to the global challenges we face are already at our disposal, but subject to two conditions being met. First, there must be a passionate belief in the need to uphold a caring spirit about needs and happiness of other peoples and nations. And second, there must be solemn adherence to the credo of multilateralism and a collaborative effort. Fortunately, both conditions are a restatement of the ideals, values, and principles of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, specifically on the COVID-19 pandemic, it had devastating effects on Tanzania's socioeconomic systems and performance. Just like most other developing countries, the pandemic robbed us of precious lives, overstretched health infrastructure and healthcare workers to the limit, led to severe budget constraints, as well as economic deceleration. Real GDP growth declined from 6.7% decadal growth attained in the pre-pandemic period to 4.8% in 2020. The key lesson we have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic is that the world needs to be better prepared in terms of national and global health systems to be able to handle future pandemics. This entails investing more in building health infrastructure and beefing up the health workforce, as well as enhancing national and regional capacity to manufacture drugs, supplies, vaccines, and medical equipment. In addition, Africa's marginalization in the provision of vaccines underscored the need for African countries to work together in the development and nurturing of indigenous solutions through joint medical and scientific research. The pandemic also brought to the fore the need to invest more in public health education, especially preventive medicine, to build individual resilience, including body fitness, healthy diet, and habits. However, I wish to acknowledge that although international support to Africa in taming the spread of the global pandemic through provision of diagnostic equipment, medicines, vaccine support programs, and financing came late, it was critical in winning the war against the pandemic. And therefore, Tanzania would like to thank all our development partners who have been working with us to deal with the pandemic and put the country on a bright post-COVID-19 recovery path. Currently, the government continues with the vaccination campaign, whereby as of 11th September, we had already vaccinated 60.56% of the targeted population. Mr. President, with respect to climate change, we are indeed at a tipping point. The United Republic of Tanzania appreciates all individual efforts and other collective measures taken thus far in implementing interventions geared at upscaling, mitigation, and adaptation as stipulated in the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 and the Paris Agreement of 2015. However, despite the efforts, we are observing unprecedented changes across the whole climate system in every region. The fact remains that the most vulnerable countries, including Tanzania, have been disproportionately affected, and nor do we possess the capacity to effectively respond. Tanzania has put forward ambitious targets on both adaptation and mitigation through national determined contributions. The government spends on average $500 million per annum on adaptation measures and up to 3% of its GDP on mitigation and building community resilience. With the help of the international community, we are committed to continually update our nationally determined contributions and make important progress to tackle climate change. Yet, unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to at least 2 degrees Celsius will be elusive. As much as we remain committed, most of the developing countries have insufficient fiscal space and weak debt sustainability status to address increasing demand for climate resilience interventions. Hence, addressing the climate crisis requires reliable access to climate finance. It is on this note that Tanzania calls on the international community to live up to its commitments made under the Paris Agreement. Enhanced capacity building, technology transfer, support for adaptation and mitigation measures, as well as the creation of independent loss and damage financial facility must be implemented in order to scale up the fight against climate change. We need to take actions and walk the talk as a matter of urgency. I must at this point emphasize that Tanzania and the rest of Africa need a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Africa must be given time to adjust, since the majority of Africans have no access to energy. The well-established principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities must be observed. In this regard, we call upon the lifting of opposition to global financing and implementation of transformative projects in our countries that aim to harness our hydrocarbon deposits for energy and other equally important uses to address our critical development needs. As long as robust environmental, social, and impact assessments have been done and concrete measures taken to effectively address environmental and democratic governance concerns of our citizens, our sovereign rights to pursue transformative projects should be respected. We also call upon transparency in the conduct of carbon credit markets so that Africa benefits fairly from our earnest effort in taking care of the carbon sinks that we are holding for the world. For example, Tanzania has preserved over 30% of our total land area, almost equivalent to the size of Germany, which includes forests and wildlife parks. Mr. President, in maintenance of peace and security, Tanzania has always believed in diplomacy as the best instrument of resolving conflict. Experience has taught us that in war, everyone loses, including the non-warring parties. It is therefore our plea that in the wake of the global conflicts, our focus should remain to be that of safeguarding human lives, especially children and women, and the well-being of the people. More so, just recently, we have witnessed disruptive effects on global supply chains, dramatic increase in food and fuel prices, as well as food shortages and decline in agricultural and industrial production around the world. All the more reasons that we must have a stake in pursuit of peaceful resolution of conflicts. As we do so, we must also leverage our abundant resources and human capabilities to address some of the impacts. Mr. President, in the same spirit, peacekeeping operations remain one of the most dependable instruments for promoting world peace and security. Tanzania is proud to have contributed men and women in 5 out of the existing 16 peacekeeping missions across the world. Despite this state of affairs, Tanzania stands ready to contribute more if requested to do so. We also continue to actively participate in regional peace initiatives, and more so now in our capacity as a member of the African Union Peace and Security Council, as well as the East African Community and SADC. Hence, we call upon the United Nations to enhance its support to the regional efforts in peace building and peacekeeping. Mr. President, the credibility of the United Nations rests on a well-represented and responsive Security Council. We therefore wish to reiterate the common African position as elaborated in the Eswatini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration with respect to the long-awaited reforms of the Security Council. It is well past time the United Nations Security Council reflected the present-day realities of the United Nations membership and not that of the 1940s. Mr. President, it would be remiss of me not to end my statement without acknowledging that the world celebrated Kiswahili language for the first time this year on 7th July, following the historic declaration of the United Nations Educational and Scientific Organization, UNESCO, designating 7th July as the World Kiswahili Language Day. As the birthplace of the Kiswahili language, Tanzania commends the efforts of the United Nations in promoting multilingualism as a core value essential in achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the African Union Agenda 2063. To conclude, let me once again reaffirm the resolve of the United Republic of Tanzania to uphold the three pillars of the United Nations, namely peace and security, development, and human rights. I also call upon all of us to renew our commitment and prioritization of actions, especially on those SDGs where we lag behind. We remain committed to working closely with the United Nations and its member states in the spirit of multilateralism and global solidarity towards a sustainable future. I thank you.
Huyu alikuwa makamu wa rais wa Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania mwaka jana, United Nation mwaka jana. Mwaka huu amerudi tena na amezungumzia sehemu 4 muhimu sana hapo mwishoni katika hotuba yake kuhusiana na peace, security, human rights pamoja na economic development au human development. Philip Isdori Mpango, huyo makamu wa rais wa Jamhuri ya Muungano wa Tanzania. Hiyo ilikuwa ni mwaka jana. Mwaka huu amerudi tena UN. Hebu tuangalie kama tunaweza kumpata hapa tena. Hiyo ilikuwa ni mwaka jana. Mwaka huu UN wamekuja na let me see here. Naona hii hapa, okay. Hebu huyu hapo. Boom.
His Excellency Dennis Francis, President of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, please allow me to start by conveying to this august assembly fraternal greetings from Her Excellency Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of the United Republic of Tanzania, who could not attend this important session due to pressing national commitments. It is a great honor and privilege to address the Assembly on her behalf and for the people of my country. I also wish to join those who have spoken before me in congratulating you, Mr. President, on your election to preside over the 78th session of the UN General Assembly. I pledge Tanzania's full support to your presidency. Similarly, I wish to pay tribute to your predecessor, His Excellency Kaba Korosis, who successfully steered the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. In the same way, I commend the Secretary General and the UN Secretariat for dedicated service to humanity in the face of many daunting global challenges. Mr. President, this year, the Assembly is meeting specifically in search of rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. However, for decades now, the persistent voice of the Global South calling in the wilderness make straight the way toward peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all has fallen on deaf ears. The hitherto strong historical solidarity, fraternity, and commitment to the principles of non-interference, equality between nations, and mutual benefit bequeathed to us by the UN founding fathers is withering away. As a result of this paralysis in multilateralism, we have now begun to witness shifting geopolitical tectonic plates and creation of new blocs, seeking to replace the now obviously dysfunctional world order. Trust among states has worn away, and there is erosion of the rule of law and a revert back to unilateralism. The effectiveness of the UN system and multilateral financial institutions is now being questioned more than ever before, calling for their immediate reform. All this is happening at a time when the world is reeling from the aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, relentless wrath of climate change, horrendous armed conflicts, global food insecurity, looming energy and debt crisis, as well as stubborn poverty and growing inequality. Furthermore, implementation of the SDGs 2030 has been disappointing, mainly as a result of unfulfilled promises of finance and technology by the global north and limited fiscal space in most African countries. In order to rebuild trust, it is imperative that the global north walks the talk on its promises and listens to the voices of the global south. Analogously, the global south must re-engineer its domestic revenue mobilization effort, including putting an end to hemorrhage of its natural resource wealth and illicit capital outflows. Mr. President, peace is undeniably a prerequisite for achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Ironically, even in this 21st century, some nations are still firing guns and missiles at each other. However, the fact is that massive production of weapons and skyrocketing military spending on armed conflicts is compromising the promises we all made to the most vulnerable among us, that is children, youth, women, and the poor, to build a better, prosperous world and create opportunities for all, leaving no one behind. In this regard, Tanzania highly commends the United Nations for its tireless efforts in maintaining international peace and security. We applaud the Secretary General's new agenda for peace, unveiled on 20th July 2023, which provides a greater vision for multilateral efforts towards peace and security on the basis of international law. I therefore implore each one of us in this assembly to give due consideration to the priorities stipulated therein, for they resonate very well with the spirit and essence of the theme of this assembly. Mr. President, Tanzania remains fully committed and ready to work with the UN family in maintaining global peace and security to make the world a safer place to live in, not only for us, but more importantly, to the generations to come. Tanzania firmly believes that the world needs to invest more in dialogue and diplomacy to prevent and resolve armed conflicts. Wars and confrontations must be avoided at all costs because in war, everyone loses, including the non-warring parties. In this regard, Tanzania has and will continue to contribute to peacemaking and peacekeeping efforts in Africa and elsewhere in the world. As of March 2023, Tanzania stood as the 12th largest contributor among 125 countries in UN peacekeeping missions. Tanzania urges the international community to increase support to regional initiatives to bring peace to war-torn parts of the African continent. Those who participate in fueling conflicts in Africa, either for the purpose of profiting from arms trade or access to blood mineral wealth, should be tracked and condemned openly by the United Nations. With regard to combating terrorism, Tanzania has strengthened capacity to deal with cross-border terrorism, working with our neighbors and international partners, especially through sharing of information and strategies. Mr. President, 3 days ago, we gathered in this hall for a second review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and implementation of the 17 SDGs. It is discouraging to note that at halftime, we are off track to meet most of the goals. The UN Secretary General's Progress Report reveals that a mere 15% of the 140 targets are on track, while a staggering 37% have either stagnated or even regressed from the 2015 baseline. This underperformance calls for supercharged implementation and partnership, especially prioritizing to scale up investment in people. Mr. President, Tanzania is fully committed to implement the SDGs as envisaged. In July this year, Tanzania presented its second voluntary national report, which shows that overall, there has been significant progress with respect to SDG 2 to 7, as indicated by an increase in food sufficiency ratio, availability of essential medicines, decline in under 5 mortality, increase in pre and primary gross enrollment rates, significant milestones in pioneering gender equality, improved water supply coverage in urban and rural areas, as well as population connected to electricity. However, only moderate performance has been recorded for SDG 1, 8, and SDG 10. To ensure successful implementation of SDGs, Tanzania is determined to take actions to improve further the domestic revenue effort while capitalizing on PPPs. We are also prioritizing investments in the social service sectors, agriculture and agribusiness, value addition and infrastructure, as well as uplifting of skills for the youth. In addition, harnessing science, technology, and innovation is also key to hastening implementation of the SDGs. Mr. President, climate change has now become the world's greatest threat. Recent natural calamities, which have devastated parts of some countries around the world, amplify the horrible effects of climate change. And on this note, Tanzania offers deepest condolences to the governments and the people of Libya and the Kingdom of Morocco for the loss of lives and properties caused by floods and earthquakes. Furthermore, the latest assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sounded an alarming reality that the world is off track, the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit agreed in Paris. Disturbingly, the report indicates that Africa is warming at an accelerated pace, outstripping the global rate. As such, climate change has and will continue to adversely impact Africa and hamper its progress. Tanzania, therefore, reiterates its call for urgent and concerted actions by all nations to cut down greenhouse gas emissions and strengthen mitigation and adaptation measures. Together, we must create an enabling environment and facilitate investments needed to unlock resources for scaling up implementation of our climate commitments and decarbonization of the global economy. We, the global community, must act with urgency. Tanzania also reiterates its call for a fair and just clean energy transition for Africa. Mr. President, unilateral coercive measures have serious adverse effects on the targeted economies and innocent lives, especially of women and children, the very people we have committed not to leave behind. Tanzania remains steadfast in its opposition to injustice, wherever it is committed and by whoever. We stand against the imposition of unjust economic sanctions and other unilateral coercive measures that undermine sovereignty and prosperity for all. Likewise, we continue to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters who continue to be denied their rights to self-determination and those living under occupation or domination. We call for the lifting of unjust sanctions and an end to the occupation or subjugation. Tanzania also advocates for peaceful resolution of all territorial disputes in accordance with the principles set out in the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, in closing, I wish to reaffirm Tanzania's unwavering commitment to support the United Nations and its member states in implementing our common global agenda. We call upon warring parties around the world to silence their guns and missiles and give prominence to peace. Let us act towards each other with humility, not arrogance. Let's heed the old wisdom that says, an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. Let's act together to address the climate crisis and hasten implementation of Agenda 2030. Our humble plea is that the voices, promises, and solutions made or provided on this rostrum ought to bring hope to the hopeless, dignity to the humiliated, and justice to all. I thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Vice President of the United Republic of Tanzania.
Hotuba hiyo ya Dr. Philip Mpango tumeiweka hapa American Swahili News pamoja na Swahili Villa Online TV. Tuliweka hotuba ya mwaka jana na tumeiweka hotuba aliyoitoa mwaka huu jana. Kwa hiyo mwende mkaisikilize na msikilize jinsi ambavyo alianza mwaka jana na jinsi alivyoanza mwaka huu. Maneno ni yale yale na ameongezea kidogo sana. Kuna tofauti si kubwa sana hotuba ya mwaka jana na hotuba ya mwaka huu. hotuba mwaka huu haikuzungumzia sana COVID, na delegation iliyokuweko pale iko balance na watu ambao wanawafahamu. Mtu mmoja shakutana naye mwenyewe mimi binafsi hapo Columbia, South Carolina. Alikuwa katika uongozi wa Rais Karume, alikuwa waziri wa elimu Zanzibar. Tulikuwa naye hapa Columbia, South Carolina. Mtu mzuri sana, nimemwona pale, nimefurahi sana kumwona. Ana advocate sana education. Sikusikia sana kwenye maeneo ya education, haikugusia sana maeneo hayo ya education, imegusia kidogo tu, lakini imegusia hotuba yake maji. Umekava maeneo mengi ya maji Tanzania, pamoja na katika maeneo ya afya wamepunguza infant mortality rate. Sijui kwenye human rights sikusikia sana civil rights, lakini amezungumzia injustice sanctions. Nafikiri alikuwa akimaanisha Cuba na Zimbabwe, ambazo bado kuna sanctions zimewekwa huko kutokana na violations za human rights. Zimbabwe amekwenda amegusia maeneo gani tena? Philip Mpango Isidori katika hotuba yake amezungumzia masuala ya democracy. Sikusikia neno democracy katika speech yake, tumesikia tu human rights and injustice sanctions na kadhalika. Kwa hiyo hiyo ni hotuba ya Dr. Philip Isdori Mpango, Vice President of United Republic of Tanzania. It was well written, imeandikwa vizuri na imetiririka vizuri, na kimsikiliza naongea kwa vizuri, nikana amepractice ile speech na ikuwa well articulated na ikuwa well delivered. Deliver vizuri. Hotuba ya kwanza mwaka jana ina tofauti na jinsi ambavyo imekuwa delivered hotuba hii ya mwaka huu. Yuko ana confidence ya mwaka huu. Sasa akitoa hotuba ya tatu, sasa hapo ndo tutaweza kucompare ya mwaka juzi, mwaka jana na mwaka huu ambao atakaotoa hiyo hotuba ya tatu. Kwa hiyo hotuba ya mwaka huu kidogo iko well delivered, well written, na kuna missing components ambazo tulitegemea zitazungumziwa pale kuhusiana kama democracy, education. Hatukusikia sana, aligusia kitu kidogo katika hayo maeneo katika hiyo hotuba. Kwa hiyo mnaweza kwenda mkaisikiliza. Naona kuna watu hapo, kina Abdalla Gunda ameweka comments. Abdalla comment amezeka comment zake Abdalla. Kwa hiyo hotuba ilikuwa well crafted, lakini kuna maeneo ambayo ameyazungumzia ya maji kufikia Millennial Development Goals pamoja na umeme. Kidogo kunahitajika tuwe wa kweli kidogo katika maeneo hayo. Kuna mgao wa umeme, kuna matatizo bado ya maji, tuna struggle licha kuwa na vyanzo vingi sana vya maji Tanzania. Tunahitaji tukae chini na tuangalie tutafanya vipi na tutajipanga vipi katika maeneo haya ya maji. Kwanza, upatikanaji wa maji safi na salama, inabidi tutengeneze pilot study na tuangalie hizi nchi ambazo zimeweza kusambaza maji katika almost between 90 to 95% katika rural areas na urban areas. Wamefanya nini na infrastructure yao ya maji ziko vipi, na budget allocation zao za hizi projects za water treatment plants na kadhalika. Tunaweza tukapeleka maji tu, lakini tuna water treatment plants ngapi hapo Tanzania, hususan kwa mfano katika jiji la Dar es Salaam? Sidhani kama tuna water treatment plants pale, au Mwanza na Arusha, miji mikubwa na Mbeya. Tunapeleka tu maji, lakini where is the water treatment plants ambazo zina produce quality and safety water kwa wananchi? Hivyo vitu lazima viangaliwe. Kwa hiyo sasa tulikuwa tunatafuta hizi hotuba, tukaanza na hotuba ya mwaka jana, ambao kama nilivyoanza kufanya analysis ni kwamba alikuwa yuko mwaka jana alikuwa hana confidence, na mwaka huu nafikiri kwa practice na labda watu waliomprep na kumark katika kuja kudeliver his speech, amedeliver very well, lakini anahitaji more, kunahitajika zaidi ya nyama ziongezwe na jinsi ya kupose. Takiwa kupose na kuzungumza maneno yake, sio tu yale maneno yaliyoandikwa pale. Inakuwa kama ameandikiwa script kwamba asitoke nje ya script, lakini anatakiwa labda ajifunze kutumia teleprompt. Nafikiri zipo pale, ingekuwa teleprompt na angekuwa anaongea vizuri tu, na hiyo ingesaidia speech ya mwaka huu ni nzuri kushinda mwaka jana, niseme hivi. Lakini kuna vitu vinakosekana katika speech, kama nilivyozungumzia democracy and human rights, na amejaribu kudaji hilo eneo. Kwa hiyo basi wekeni comments, na katika hii speech wekeni comments, msikilize. Ni hotuba, naweza kusema tu kwamba sio hotuba mbaya sana, lakini bado haijafikia ile level kama ya hotuba za Mwalimu Nyerere ambazo alikuwa akizitoa UN, pamoja na hotuba yake ya mwisho ya mwaka 1985 ambayo ilisikilizwa karibia na watu wote. Hakuna mtu yeyote aliyetoka. Viongozi wote karibia duniani walikuwepo ambao ni wanachama wa UN, na ilikuwa tutaitafuta hiyo hotuba ya Mwalimu, afu tutakuja tutaicheza katika wiki hii, kwa sababu tumeanza kuicheza hotuba ya kwanza Philip Mpango mwaka jana, tukaja tukaicheza na hii sasa hivi. Tutafuta na hotuba ya Mama Samia vile nao tutaileta hapa. Okay, kwa hiyo it's 1:35 a.m. in the morning huku katika studio yetu ya Columbia, South Carolina. Bushatri, tunakamilisha kipindi hiki cha leo cha maalum kabisa ambacho kilikuwa kimetoa hotuba ya Dr. Philip Isdor Mpango, Vice President of United Republic of Tanzania, ambaye alikuja hapa kwenye vikao kuanzia tarehe 20 mpaka tarehe 26, sijui ngapi utakuwa namaliza mkutano ya kwa Umoja wa Mataifa, kikao cha 78 hiki. Kwa hiyo basi tunamalizia kipindi chetu hiki special hiki ambacho kimekuja maalum kabisa, kimeangalia hotuba hizi hotuba za Dr. Philip Mpango. Kwa hiyo ambao mjisubscribe American Swahili News pamoja na Swahili Villa Online TV, tunaombeni mwende msubscribe, msambaze video hii, mshare, mlike na kadhalika, mweke comment. Huyu alikuwa Dr. Philip Mpango akiongea kutoka katika Umoja wa Mataifa hapo New York, na ametoa hotuba yake kama tulivyoigusia. Tumechambua kwa kifupi tu, na tunasema peace, na tunawatakieni asubuhi njema huko Tanzania na East Africa. Boom.